Hello, Wizards. Today, we've got another exciting hand history review played between Linus Love and Berri Sweet. Before we get into it, you guys should know that this was recorded back in February of 2022, so our interface and solutions have been updated since then. We thought we should release this video anyway, as you guys might enjoy the content. Anyway, here's the hand. So for those that don't know, Linus and Berri have been battling it out in the high-stakes heads-up streets lately. So far, it's been going pretty well for Berri. We're going to go through a few of their more exciting hands, followed by an in-depth GTO review. Linus opens on the button with ace-10 off. Berri calls queen-jack off. 10-3-2 rainbow. We see a third pot c-bet. And Berri check raises. Linus 3-bets. Berri 4-bets with queen high. And Linus just calls. Turn 10 gives him trips. Berri continues to barrel. Linus smooth plays it. Berri shoves the river, and Linus has an easy call with trip 10s. Alright, let's dive into the GTO analysis. For this hand, I'm using the heads-up simple cash game solutions 100 big blinds deep. Linus opens, and Berri calls in the big blind with queen-jack off. We see a 10-3-2 rainbow board. Check. Actions on Linus. So before we proceed, I should point out that this won't just be a strategy review. Part of my goal here is to teach you guys how to use GTO Wizard more effectively. I'm going to take you through my process, which is a little more intuitive and step back. I don't really fixate on frequencies so much as I do look for overarching patterns. So when a lot of people look at this hand matrix, they're going to get confused. How do you remember all of this stuff? And the truth is you don't. You don't remember all of this stuff. You look for heuristics. So on 10-3-2, there's really two things you should be paying attention to. The first thing is, do you have an overcard to the 10? And the second thing is, do you have any straight draw potential with the 2 and the 3? Those are the two main factors that'll make you want to bet more often. For example, these lower cards, which connect better to the 2 and the 3, tend to bet more often. These overcards, like king-jack and queen-jack, tend to bet more often. And overcards where you have one middling card and one overcard tend to be checked more often. Now you can get a little more in-depth by exploring the filters. For example, you can see overpairs plus always betting. You can see top pair betting with a better kicker more often. You can see, for example, underpairs betting when they're more vulnerable. Second and third pair betting more often when they have an overcard. And you can also get into it with suits. So for example, I can change this to horizontal mode. That'll show me every combination. And here we see this pattern where the spade tends to be checked more often because it doesn't have a backdoor flush draw. Alternatively, you can apply a suit filter. So for example, including spade, here we see the checking frequency is 45%. Apply this filter, goes up to 49%. Apply it again, it goes up to 54%. So you can already develop some very basic heuristics that way. Now, something else you should always do in these spots is just take a look at the ranges tab, get a sense for how this board hits both players. So here we can see it's a very symmetrical equity distribution. No one really has much of a nut advantage either way. Equity is almost exactly 50-50. But the big difference is that the in-position player will realize more equity and therefore has more EV. Now, you may be asking yourself at this point, how am I going to know all of this stuff? Well, one strategy you can use to try and figure out these spots more easily is to look for general trends in the aggregate reports. So here we see a report of all 1755 flops. I'm going to filter this report for rainbow, unpaired, disconnected boards, and then I'm going to group it by rank. So here we see ace high boards, king high boards, so on and so forth. Now we notice a pattern jumps up pretty immediately. As this number gets lower, the bet size increases and the bet frequency decreases, right? So for example, On a 7 high disconnected rainbow flop, you typically want to bet larger. And as that goes up to, say, a king high or queen high flop, you want to use a smaller bet size more frequently. 10 high sits somewhere right in the middle there, but if we get a little more specific with our filters, we can view flops. And here you see that some 10 high boards are even overbetting, but these really dry ones like 10-3-2 have less draw potential and therefore tend to use smaller bet sizes. So now that we have a sense for how the spot plays, let's dive into the action. Linus decides to go for a 1/3 bet here. Action's on Berri. So facing this 1/3 bet, Berri has a decision to make with his queen jack off. Does he want to call or does he want to check raise it? I think some players would just fold this, but in a heads-up game, that's a little too tight. Queen jack has a lot of equity against the top of their range. For example, it can outdraw a lot of 10x hands, and for that reason, it plays more like a draw, and it needs to continue here. So let's take a look at the overall thresholds, because I'm not just interested in what queen jack is doing, I'm interested in what Linus is targeting with this bet. We can see hands as strong as king x start to fold here. Get a better sense for that in the filters tab, where we can see this is about the line of your continue range, king high no mate hands. We can see that a little more easily in the breakdown tab, where all the ace highs are still calling, but king high and worse than king high start to fold versus this size. As far as the raising range goes, we can see it splits its size between 3 different types of raises here, and some players will see this and just immediately panic. But don't panic, you're not expected to memorize 3 different raise sizes. What you can do is simply group them together and get a better general sense of things. Hover over this icon to see how the raising range is constructed. We can see that about 30% of the raise is top pair plus for value, and the rest of it is merging with these weak pairs and draws. In general, you want to use about 1/3 value to 2/3 bluffs on a flop check raise in a single raise pot. The math behind that is set up so that you can have good value to bluff ratios by the river. The math is a little too complex to get into for this video, but if you guys want more of that toy game content, just let me know in the comments. So something else you can do here is compare the raising frequency on this board to the raising frequency on the reports. And we see that across all flops, it tends to raise about 11% facing a 3rd pot bet. So now you have a general idea of how often you ought to be raising in these spots. We can see it raises these sets, 2 pair for value. It does have a little bit of top pair in there. And for draws, we see a lot of things that connect with the 2 and the 3 and that have overcards. So to see that, let's filter by raise. Let's apply weak and trash hand filters, and these are the bluffs. 6-5, 5-4, 6-4, Jack-4, Jack-5. All of these hands have good backdoor straight draw potential, good backdoor flush draw potential, and potentially overcards to top pair. That's how you know it's a good bluff candidate. If we look at the expected value, we can get a better sense for which hands are close. So for example, ace X here is kind of close, even though it's pure calling. King X with a backdoor is kind of close, even though it's pure calling. These are your threshold hands, and it's important to pay attention to which hands are kind of close so that you can readily adapt your strategy. We see that Queen Jack can check raise here. And Berri does just that. Action on Linus. So facing this check raise, we can see that the GTO solution tends to just call or fold, not doing a whole lot of raising in general. I think a lot of players would just simplify this to a 2-action strategy and not raise at all. And if we compare it to the reports, we can see that over all possible flops, in position is not raising here very much at all, only about 3%. Part of the reason for that is that Berri's check raise is quite polarized. We can see in the best hands category here, these are hands with at least 75% equity. 26% of Berri's range consists of best hands, while only about 3.7% of Linus's range contains these hands. We can get A little more detailed breakdown in the advanced tab here. And again, we see this big nut advantage for Berri, and that's going to prevent Linus from getting too out of line with any more raises. However, Linus is no normal human. He knows that ace 10 off is one of your highest frequency 3-bets here. And more so than sets, than 2-pair. In fact, the type of hands it likes to raise for value typically include these vulnerable made hands. So here you can see I've applied a raise filter, I've applied a good and a best hands filter, and we can see that hands which raise for value consists of these vulnerable value hands like jacks, ace 10, king 10. These hands are ahead of the top pair, medium kicker kind of stuff that Berri's raising with, while also being vulnerable enough to benefit from a raise rather than trying to keep Berri's range super wide. So Linus makes the 3-bet, actions on Berri. Facing the 3-bet, Queen Jack off has another decision to make. We can see that it's indifferent between folding, calling, and raising. Now, some people might be surprised, like, why on earth would you call with Queen High here? But keep in mind, this hand does play very close to a draw. Got 2 overcards against the 10. You block jacks, which are one of Linus's most common value bets here. So this hand can play as a call sometimes. Berri, however, elects to 4-bet it. And you can't really blame him because in general, you're going to 4-bet a lot here. This is because, first of all, you're out of position, so there's less incentive to call and more incentive to take the pot down now. We can see that reflected in the reports tab. Facing a 3-bet, we can see out of position generally 4-bets quite frequently. And this is partly to do with the fact, not just that you're out of position, but also that the 3-bet uses very strong bluffs. So that further decreases your incentive to call and increases your incentive to raise them off those strong bluffs. Now, we can see the raise here mainly consists of sets and 2-pair for value, merging with some top pair, second pair, and a whole lot of gut shots. So Berri puts in the 4-bet, actions back on Linus with ace 10 off. So we see a series of raises, actions back on Linus with his ace 10 offsuit. And here we can see that this hand shoves quite frequently here. Same with queens and jacks. These hands are all vulnerable value hands that benefit from folding out those strong draws and just getting the stacks in now. However, ace 10 can also mix in calls. Now we see, as again, I'm going to compare to the general reports, even though we're in position here, it's raising a ton. 18.6% of in position's range is now shoving. And this is, again, because the value of those bluffs is quite high. So there's more value in folding out those bluffs and less value in calling as much. Let's take a quick peek at the ranges tab again. And I want to see the equity graph in full. Here we can see this blue line, that's Berri's line, has a massive advantage throughout. So Linus really does need to fold quite a bit to catch up here. So he makes the call, and we turn a 10 of spades. The 10 of spades is an absolute disaster for Berri's range. It's really bad. The problem is that it removes a lot of these 10-3, 10-2 combos from his range, as well as counterfeits his 3 deuce. So it severely degrades the value portion of his range. We can see that reflected in the turn reports. So this shows the strategy across all possible turn cards. You can see that board pairing cards in general, like 10s, 3s, and 2s, remove a lot of those value hands from his range, and therefore the solver bets these cards less often. On contrast, turns which complete a lot of straight draws, such as 4s, 5s, 6s, even an ace, these tend to be bet more frequently as they tend to be better for Berri's range. Here we can see an EV distribution by selecting these 2 buttons up top. And in fact, we can make this a little easier to look at by just grouping like cards together. Something else you might want to try here is filtering for Berri's exact hand. So for example, here he has Queen of Spades Jack of clubs. And now we can see the strategy for this hand specifically. Tends to bet more aggressively, using some of these all-in sizes when it picks up that gut shot, and in general barreling quite frequently on low cards and on an ace. So despite this being a terrible card for his range, the solver does like to check with Queen Jack here, but Berri doesn't play by our rules, he only plays by his own rules. He continues for third pot, actions on us, and if you're Linus here and you've got ace 10, you might be thinking, hey, this is a value hand. You know, I'm way ahead. I've got trips with top kicker. What could go wrong? But keep in mind, this was a 4-bet on the flop. Your ace 10 is not so much a value hand here as it is a medium strength showdown value hand. You can see it only has about 52% equity. So when you see the solver, for example, shoving king 10 here, that's more of an equity realization play than a value bet. Here in the ranges tab, we can see that Berri's range is supposed to be about 50% full houses, which have our trips crushed, of course. Now, in practice, he might be a little more bluff heavy, given that he's barreling his queen jack here, but hey, who knows? So Linus makes the call, and there's only about a half pot behind on the river, and we get the 8 of spades. Now, to be honest, the 8 of spades is kind of a non-consequential brick at this point because Berri is polarized to boats, trips, and garbage, and not much in between. It doesn't really interact with the ranges much. We can see there's about a 41% pot behind, and the solver constructs the shoving range using about 75% boats and 25% bluffs. So what's interesting about a 75-25 split? Well, if we just run a quick pot odds calculation, Berri's shoving 45, the pot after it's called is about 200. Linus needs about 22-23% equity, and the solver is bluffing about a quarter of the time. So that's about right. Now, at this point, Berri can't afford to give up too much. We can see the solver is barreling quite often. If you 4-bet the flop, barrel the turn, and then give up a ton on the river, you're probably going to be very exploitable, and most likely you're over bluffing earlier streets. So he knows he does need to shove quite a bit here. However, Queen Jack in particular, the solver mostly just gives up with this hand. I'm going to switch over to full height for a second. This makes it easier to see things in the range. I don't normally recommend this view because it's a little misleading. Normalized will give you a better picture of what's actually going on, but when you want to zoom in on some combos, full height is okay. Here we can see that it does prefer to shove with the queen of diamonds, and I think this is just to do with a blocker effect. There's no 10 of diamonds on the board, so, you know, queen jack with the queen of diamonds tends to block more queen 10 type hands. So, anyway, Berri shoves, and actions back on Linus. And what to do with ace 10 here? Well, we see all the trips. All the trips are calling here, and that's mainly just due to blocker effect. You're not even that happy to call. You have about 25% equity. You're really close to indifferent. These trips always call due to some small blocker effects. However, if Berri was even a little bit too value heavy, the solver would snap fold all of these trips. So what's Berri actually targeting with this size? Well, mostly overpairs. Jacks, queens, kings, aces. We can see that these hands have almost exactly the right pot odds to call or fold. They're very close to the line. So these are the hands that are actually being targeted. In the breakdown tab, we can maybe get an easier way to view the thresholds. So overpairs, this is the indifference region. Trips plus, pretty much always calling. And you don't even really have any combinations of, you know, second pair, even though it does call sometimes, just due to blocker effects. Similarly, we can see, for example, 8-2 calling here. That's mainly just because the deuce blocks a good chunk of Berri's value range. So in the ranges tab, we're going to see a polarization effect. So this blue line, this is Berri's equity distribution. we can see he has a lot of very strong hands, very weak hands, whereas Linus has all of these bluff catchers. And we can see that the majority of Linus's range does sit on this long, flat green line, indicating that these hands are very close to indifferent. Realistically, any hand that beats these bluffs and loses to this value is going to sit somewhere along this indifferent bluff catcher region. Nevertheless, Linus knows that ace-10 here is a snap call. He makes the call, catches the bluff, and takes it down. Wow. What a fascinating line by both players. With a 3-bet and then a 4-bet correctly on the flop, barreling turn, shoving river, just ice in his veins. Really hope we can see more from these players going forward. I'm really enjoying these heads-up matches. And I hope you guys got a few things out of my process and learned a few tips and tricks along the way. As always, if you want to discuss the theory, please join our Discord, link in the description, and feel free to leave a comment, like, subscribe, and hit that bell. That's all for now. Take care.